My father was one of the many who died of mesothelioma, a cancer caused by asbestos inhalation. His death and many others could have been prevented had the authorities acted on the information available at the time. This is my story of asbestos.
There's a man in my bed, I used to love him. His kisses used to take my breath away. There's a man in my bed, I hardly know him. I wipe his face and hold his hand and watch him as he slowly fades away. And he fades away, not like leaves that fall in autumn, turning gold against the grey. He fades away, like the bloodstains on a pillowcase that I wash every day. He fades away. There's a man in my bed, he's on a pension, although he's only 50.
My father and many others, men and women, worked in the war industries at home. Dad's job was repairing aircraft. At the end of World War II, lifestyles changed. Women who had been the mainstay of the workforce reluctantly returned to domestic life. Countless women washed their husbands' work clothes, exposing themselves and probably their children to the deadly asbestos fibres.
Like the bloodstains on my pillowcase that I wash every day. He fades away.
In January we went up the coast, and in the school holidays we played in our backyards. I had no idea that the pieces of fibro I used playing hopscotch and drawing on pavements contained deadly asbestos fibres. As incidences of mesothelioma increased in the 60s and 70s, many GPs remained uninformed about the disease. In the mid-90s, I went on a search to understand how and why the effects of asbestos was not reported earlier, and even now why there is so little publicity. By the year 2010, it has been estimated that 30,000 people will have died from asbestos-related injuries. That's around 500 people a year. In 1917, James Hardie and Company opened the asbestos cement factory at Camellia near the Parramatta River in New South Wales. By the late 1920s, Hardie's began to produce asbestos cement, which was used especially in the construction industry. By 1936, asbestos fibrillite was being manufactured. At this time, both the British Parliament and the United States were aware of asbestos as a serious health hazard. Evidence in medical reports had been published confirming that asbestos caused lung cancer. The Australian Public Health Department also had reports from workers suffering from asbestos-related diseases in the James Hardie factory in Western Australia. When Japan entered World War II in the 40s, Hardie's began to supply asbestos for brake linings for the Australian military aircrafts and tanks. In the post-war period, the construction industry escalated. Schools, cinemas and buildings were sprayed with asbestos insulation. Railways also used huge amounts of asbestos, and asbestos pipes were installed throughout Australia. The asbestos industry boomed. My father worked on the Snowy Mountains project. Truckloads of blue asbestos were used to insulate pipes. The workers were not informed of the dangers, nor was protection provided. And this was despite the availability of comprehensive studies done in the United States and England on workers from the 1930s, confirming the fatal risks associated with asbestos exposure. In the mid-50s, huge public campaigns were launched to fight tuberculosis. Many cases of mesothelioma were probably misdiagnosed, and those that were recognised remained unreported. During the 60s, safety campaigns began to ensure workers' health, but still asbestos protection was not included. In the mid-60s, Hardie's moved the asbestos cement factories to Malaysia and Indonesia. In my search for answers, I came across a group of retired men, many of them my father's age. I was inspired by their energy and dedication in lobbying government bodies. Some of these men had been exposed to asbestos, others had mesothelioma, many had seen their workmates die.
Yeah, it's about 2 years ago that we got worried about the number of members that have been injured by asbestos and the effects of asbestos, and that by our experience we've found out that resolutions don't mean nothing, so it's to organise people. So we set up an asbestos committee to delve into it, and how our whole being is meant to organise people to realise the dangers that are there. You get injured by the effects of asbestos, not because of any haphazard things, but people have known about the danger of asbestos for 40 or 50 years, but it's been hidden from people. So hence the asbestos committee, and hence our attempts to organise other people into doing something about it. Now that the question about asbestos was to be raised, but as the waterside workers weren't...
I worked in the power industry in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, and I become a victim of asbestos dusting. I had investigative surgery on my lungs. The first evidence we had, hard evidence we had in the power industry, was when a worker's brother who died brought in his death certificate showing asbestos was the cause of a tumour and a cancer that caused his death. And that alerted the workers in the power industry who had been breathing and working in asbestos dust for many years to start a campaign of agitation to have it all cleaned up.
I personally became very interested when a young fellow, 45, was found to have mesothelioma, and I was in his company for the next 6 months till he died. Once you get mesothelioma, there's no cure. He left 4 children and a wife, destitute, and we were able to come together and assist him and his family get whatever compensation was available in this society today.
I've got pleural thickening and plaques, but the doctors at the dust board say I haven't got a disease because I haven't got a malignancy, and I think that we should call it an injury, and I feel I've been injured by asbestos the same as most other people that have worked with it.
And by the time my husband got ill with it, you can't spot it in scans or biopsies, and they finally gave him a thoracotomy, which was to test the lung to prove he had it. And they had to take ribs out. The lungs were stuck to the ribs, and it was in a dreadful state.
At least 80% of the directors are women who have come from the ranks of housewives.
Well, yes, I first encountered it when I joined the Navy. I was on the old aircraft carrier, the Vengeance, and those ships were insulated with asbestos. The first thing when we were introduced into the mess decks was the whole place was scrubbed out every morning, and they said, don't forget to dust down the cable carriers. Well, where can you get dust in the middle of the ocean? This photo here is taken on board the HMAS Anzac, somewhere off Japan. As you can see, the clothing we had are ordinary King G overalls, and the protective masks we had was rags out of the rag bin. That is the same protective clothing that's given to any dockyard worker, any powerhouse worker, so it wasn't just the way the Navy did it, it was the way everybody did it. The other photograph is at Flinders Naval Depot, where they had a big oil pit which they set alight, and you donned an asbestos suit which was called a Fearnaut suit, and you went in and fought this fire, and they instruct you how to put it out. And nearly everybody from the engineering school went through this type of firefighting. There was also another apparatus, they used to call it I think it was a Patent 230, which was a face mask that you put on, and there was about a 30-foot tube which was made out of woven asbestos, and that was used to go down into smoke-filled compartments or into noxious fuel tanks. There is no research being done here in Sydney, to my knowledge. The only treatment any of the people with the mesothelioma are getting is palliative care, which is fairly cost-effective, and it just doesn't give the victim any hope.
These men and women were the youth of yesterday, unknowingly exposed to asbestos. Debates continued over dust-related diseases. State parliamentarians argued over what, if any, compensation should be left to the families in the event of workers' deaths. The first compensation case was paid out in 1968 by the newly appointed Dust Disease Board set up by the New South Wales state government. The board had been pressured by the Broken Hill miners and unions to protect workers' rights. Finally, in the early 70s, companies such as James Hardie's and CSR set out to reduce asbestos production. In 1978, James Hardie's had assets of up to $360 million. In 1981, my father was diagnosed with mesothelioma. He died 6 months later. He'd only just retired and was looking forward to spending his time painting and sharing life with his family. He gave 50 years of his life to the Australian workforce. Australia still imports 1,700 tonnes of asbestos a year. Asbestos is not classified as dangerous goods. The asbestos industry has generated enormous wealth for some in Australia. But for many, like my father, it took away life itself. Human life is the most precious commodity of all. Why should it be made so fragile by the greed of industry?
There's a man in my bed, I used to love him. His kisses used to take my breath away. There's a man in my bed, I hardly know him. I wipe his face and hold his hand and watch him as he slowly fades away. And he fades away. not like leaves that fall in autumn, turning gold against the grey, he fades away. Like the bloodstains on a pillowcase that I wash every day, he fades away. There's a man in my bed, he's on a pension, although he's only 50 years of age. The lawyer says we might get compensation in the course of due procedure, but he wouldn't say for certain at this stage. But he fades away, not like leaves that fall in autumn, turning gold against the grey, he fades away. Like the bloodstains on my pillowcase that I wash every day, he fades away. And he's not the only one whose lungs are filled with dust in daily work, in ship and dam and mine. So many young men old before their time and dying slow, they fade away. A wheezing bag of bones